Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me. This is Dr. Grace Estrada, and today we are covering Chapter 7, Survey Research in Psych 18 Research Methods. Okay, so before we get started, I do want to recap the whole idea of variables. Remember that we have 4 variable types, often called scales of measure. They are nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. So nominal and ordinal variables are considered qualitative because they don't have a kind of a number value affiliated with them. So nominal variables are those that are categorical. They're just different. We're not saying one is better than the other. An example of a nominal variable could be occupation, right? Maybe you have teachers, you have firefighters, just different categories, but we're not ranking anything. Ordinal is different like nominal, but now you are ranking. You're including some kind of evaluative judgment on them, or you're asking the person who's reading it to give an evaluative judgment. So for example, first place, second place, third place in the Olympics, you don't know, how much faster was the first place sprinter than the second place sprinter. You don't know that. All you know is that they were the fastest. For quantitative variables, they are interval and ratio. So interval variables are different like nominal, they're ranked like ordinal, but now the distances between first and second are predictable, and it's equal to the distance between second and third. What it is with interval variables is that the 0 does not mean that it is missing. The example we use is temperature, or maybe there is no 0. You don't have a GPA, like a grade of 0, you have A, B, C, D, F, but you don't have the grade of 0. Now, percentages are something that we call ratio scale variables. That is, it's like nominal because they're distinct. It's like ordinal because they're ranked. It's like interval because they're meaningful distances, but now the 0 means the absence of that particular variable. And these are the ones we are most used to in our everyday lives. If I ask you, how many books do you have on Freud? And you say 0, I know it means you don't have any books, right? So that's what we mean by meaningful 0. If I tell you it is 0 degrees Celsius outside, that doesn't mean that there's no temperature, right? So that's kind of the way to consider the different variables. It's important to remember these variable types because when we talk about surveys, there are going to be different ways we can ask questions. And the way we ask them, the variables we collect, is going to determine how we're going to do the analysis afterwards. So remember, categorical variables have no numerical properties, right? Then you have continuous variables, which are the interval and ratio, and those are the ones that have quantitative values. It's really easy to do mathematical calculations on those. So nominal and ordinal are considered categorical variables. Interval and ratio are considered continuous or quantitative variables. Any questions about this little recap? Okay. All right, survey research is the most common type we use, right? You order something from Amazon, they'll send you a survey. You order something from Etsy, they'll send you a survey. It's often used because it's an easy way to collect data, right? It's cheap, especially when it's online. And, we can gather a lot of data. What makes survey research distinct is it's self-report. So unlike an experiments, it's the researcher putting participants through certain conditions and we are observing what they do. Usually it's behavioral. We're not asking them questions, right? So self-report is what's different with surveys. Usually we get the information through questionnaires and we also get them through interviews. So some examples of information we collect through surveys are demographic variables, such as somebody's age, their ethnicity, their gender identification, those kind of things. We might even ask questions about physical characteristics, right? Hair color or things that we can easily observe. We can just ask through self-report. Survey research, because of the nature of this research, it's really important to sample populations properly. So this kind of goes back to with experiments, because we have random assignment, random sampling is not as critical to the internal validity of an experiment. On the other hand, surveys have no manipulation. It has no exertion of any kind of control. So in a survey design, the importance of sampling becomes really prominent. Two things are important in survey design. It's the wording of the questions and the sampling component. Any questions about this? Okay. Why do we use surveys? Well, remember that for one thing, it is a snapshot, a point in time when somebody is responding to the survey, that's how they feel. It doesn't mean that a week from today, if you give them the same survey, they're going to answer the same way, right? So when you are using a survey design and you talk about your results, it's important not to make it sound as if those results are going on forever, because it is actually a snapshot of what the participants are reporting at that point in time. It's very useful for studying associations. We use surveys for correlations all the time, right? So you can get a lot of information about many different variables in a short period of time, and that makes them extremely attractive for research. So it enables the collection of a large amount of data. So it's really cost effective. And we often use it as a complement to other research methods. Like when I talked about the longitudinal, cross-sectional, those different types of research, we usually include surveys with them. We want to know, we'll ask questions maybe about how they're perceiving certain components of the world. Like, what do you think about pollution? And we ask them when they're 5 years old, when they're 10 years old, when they're 15 years old, and see if their attitudes change. So surveys are a really important part of many different research designs. You can actually have an experiment in which there is a survey component because you're collecting demographic data about your participants, for example. So you'll see surveys incorporated in many aspects of research. So some examples of surveys are academic research. You all we do student surveys all the time, right? Market research, that's an example of that would be what you get after you purchase something from Amazon or Etsy. Election polling, this is an election year. People love to do exit surveys, right? After you voted, they'll ask you, who did you vote for? And people, will say, some people will lie and other people will say the truth. It depends on somebody, on how they feel, on how comfortable they are. Employee satisfaction surveys, user experience surveys. User experience is a very big field in psychology right now. I'm actually trying to pull together a certificate for that so that people have, something to show that they are going to be especially good at that job. Tech companies love user experience researchers. So when we think about surveys, it's important, right? We're in psychology, to think about the cognitive process involved when someone takes a survey. So the first thing you do when you read a survey question is you interpret it, right? So you read the question to understand the concept or the issue. This is why it's really important to word the questions carefully. You want to make sure that people understand what it is you're trying to get at. Second part is information retrieval. So once the person thinks they understand what you're asking, now the person who's taking the survey, their job is to go back in their mind and think about what sort of information is being asked of them, right? Third one is judgment formation. Remember, surveys are self-report, right? So it depends on the question. If you ask a question in a way that makes the person answering the question uncomfortable in any way, you're going to reduce the probability that they will answer honestly, and that's going to damage your validity of your study, right? So with judgment formation, what I mean by that is someone reads the question, they think about the question, and now they're deciding how are they going to answer the question, right? Am I going to really tell these strangers what I think about this? Response formatting is, now you've decided, okay, I'm going to answer it in this way. This is how I'm going to articulate it. So this could be a short answer. right? That's more likely a short answer component if they have to think about response formatting. And then finally, response editing. They're going to look and see, did I select the right one? If it's multiple choice, response editing entails looking at the answers and making sure that you selected the one you wanted others to see. So those are the 5 steps that are involved with taking a survey. Any questions about these 5 steps? And question interpretation, information retrieval, judgment formation, response formatting, and response editing. Okay. All right, so what do you ask, right? You have these people who are captive audiences, they're looking at your packet or whatever, and now you get to ask them questions. So it's important to be respectful of people's time, right? So you want to make sure that the questions you ask are driven by your research objective. What is your research goal? This is why we talk about research questions, right? Everything goes back to your research question and what you really want to do with your research. Are you trying to describe something? Are you trying to explain something? Are you trying to predict something? Are you trying to control something? So once you've determined your research question, as a researcher, you need to think about your goal. Those 2 components are going to derive, like that's where your questions are going to be driven from, right? What do you want to find out from these people, right? The researcher must decide what they want to know. Sometimes it could be about attitudes and beliefs. Remember that there isn't that strong a correlation between attitudes and behaviors. So behaviors are going to be a separate component. Attitudes and beliefs. What do you think about climate change, right? Those kind of questions, attitudes and beliefs. They could be about facts and demographics. When was the last, what grade were you in 1995? That's a fact. Which ethnicity or race do you identify with? That would be a demographic question. Which age range are you in? That would be another demographic question. We may also ask about behaviors. So how many schools did you attend since high school? How many community college classes have you taken in the last 2 years? So those are kind of things that are like behaviors. So the textbook actually outlines a lot of things to consider when writing questions. I'm going to summarize them in something called BRUSO. So this is an acronym for you to all remember when you are forming survey questions. It should be brief, that's the B. And that means that surveys should not be too long, right? People get tired when they start taking surveys that are 10 pages long, for example. The questions should be relevant. Only questions that have to do with the research question should be asked. It kind of makes sense. This is especially important when you're trying to establish reliability in your measure. The question should be unambiguous. There should be only one way to interpret questions. So this maximizes the idea that you are actually getting to the construct you're trying to understand. If you have long, wordy questions that can be interpreted many ways, that is going to hurt your validity, right? It's going to hurt your construct validity. So you make sure that the questions you ask are very simple and straightforward. S is for specific. The question should be clear and focused on only one concept at a time. Again, that is connected to the unambiguous component. And then objective. Questions should not reflect researcher biases. And I'll talk about how to address, different parts. So brief is pretty straightforward, shouldn't be too long. Relevant, I feel like, is also straightforward. Only questions that pertain to the research question should be asked. Don't ask about hair color if it has nothing to do with climate change, for example. How about being ambiguous? What does that mean? Well, there are different ways a question can be ambiguous. If somebody uses a lot of jargon, specific terms that are specific to a discipline that ordinary people wouldn't understand, then it's going to be ambiguous, right? They're not going to know how to interpret it properly. If you use a lot of slang, slang is culturally specific. It's also generationally specific. Some of the slang terms that the Gen Alpha and the Zoomers use, a Gen Xer like me would not understand. So you want to avoid slang as much as possible. You also want to avoid using abbreviations that have not been defined, because the abbreviations could mean something different in a different discipline. So here's a funny one, right? Many years ago, there was an illness called SARS. It was a respiratory illness. Now at Evergreen, we have a computer system that's called SARS as part of our early alert. And so right there, you have the same, letters, SARS, and they can mean completely different things to different people. So you want to make sure you minimize the use of abbreviations. If you're going to use an abbreviation, you make sure you spell out all the words before you use it in the survey. So for example, has your circadian rhythm changed with your developmental stage? Well, a lot of people don't know what a circadian rhythm is, right? So you might instead of saying circadian rhythm, you might say, has your sleeping cycle changed as you've gotten older? That's a much more straightforward way to ask that. Circadian rhythm with your developmental stage, that, maybe kids in college would understand that, or people who are college educated. But remember that the majority of the population is not actually college educated. When you write surveys, we're actually advised to write at a 5th grade level. And that's how we make sure that things are ambiguous and simple and concise. Another example. Have you noticed a change in your, so that's the way to do it. Instead of has your circadian rhythm changed with your developmental stage? A more straightforward way to say it is, have you noticed a change in your sleep patterns as you've gotten older? Another way to avoid being ambiguous is to avoid negative wording. Example, should schools not allow junk food in school cafeterias? So the not allow can be confusing when people are reading the question, especially if you're an English language learner. These, negative terms might be very confusing. A more straightforward way to ask is, should schools only offer healthy food in cafeterias? So in sum, what you want to make sure is you need to consider who your potential responders are, and you should never assume that they have the same knowledge base that you have. So you want to try again to word things at about a 5th grade level. Any questions about being unambiguous? Okay. Being specific. There is a term, it's very jargony, it's called a double-barreled question. A double-barreled question is a question that actually has 2 components. And when somebody answers, it's not clear what they're answering. So an example is, do you support homework and PE for children? If somebody said yes, how are you going to interpret that? Are they saying yes because they support homework? Are they saying yes because they support PE? Or are they saying yes because they support both? Somebody reading this question wouldn't know how to answer. If what if you support homework but not PE? Or what if you support PE and not homework? And it's a yes or no response, or even if it's a Likert scale response, because it's it's double-barreled, it's ambiguous both for the person interpreting the answer and for the person who's answering the question. So you want to avoid that. Instead, you break it up. Do you support 1 hour of homework for children in grades 5 to 8? And do you support PE for children in grades K through 8? So we're using acronyms here, so we should actually say physical education, just to be clear. So instead of having this double-barreled question, what you want to do is break up and make sure that your question only addresses 1 component at a time. Another part that's important to consider when you're forming survey questions is simplicity versus specificity. So it is important to be concise, but you also have to be specific enough that you're getting the information you actually want. For example, do you drink alcohol? That is a terrible question as a survey question because it's so vague. What does that even mean? Well, I drank alcohol. The last time I drank alcohol was 4 years ago, but I did drink it. So I could say yes, right? On the other hand, what if it's somebody who drinks, 3 drinks a week or something like that, right? So the answer yes would not actually tell the researcher, valuable information. So a better way to ask would be, how often do you drink more than a glass of wine in an hour? See, it's specific. It's one concept, it has to do with drinking, but now it's specific enough that if they say 4 times a week, then that is a meaningful information where you can actually use that data to make some kind of conclusion. Any questions about being specific? Okay. Objective. When I say objective, you want to make sure you word questions in a way that do not sound judgmental, right? Loaded questions. An example of a loaded question. Do you think it is dangerous to allow preschoolers to play in the same yard as fourth graders? So the term dangerous has an implication there, right? People don't want to put preschoolers in danger. So they're going to say, yes, right? It's dangerous. I don't want them to get hurt. A better way to put it that seems less judgmental would be, should preschool children play in the same yard at the same time as children 2 to 3 years older than they are? So you've taken away that very kind of loaded question, dangerous, and now you're getting to the point that you really want to know is, how do people feel about children of different ages playing at the same time? Right? That's what you're just asking. Avoid distant future intentions. So, example of this. Suppose a new vegan grocery store opened in your neighborhood. Would you shop there? The problem with that is that people, remember, it's a point in time, this survey, when people are answering, and a new vegan grocery store opening could be years away. So is it really helpful to be asking something like that? Like you might say, would you be interested in a grocery store opening within the next 2 years? That's a little better than saying, would you shop there? Because it's kind of useless. We don't know if somebody actually would or not. You might instead just say, how often do you shop at your local grocery store? And then that would give you a sense of their behavioral patterns instead. Any questions about being objective? Okay, other considerations. You want to avoid overlapping or unbalanced response categories. So for example, are you satisfied with your job or are there things you do not like about it? Double-barreled, right? You should just ask if somebody is satisfied with their job or ask if there are things they don't want in it, right? How much do you agree with this statement? I feel satisfied with my job. So this is a better way to find out. Strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. That way you have a rating and that gives you meaningful information about how people feel about their place of employment. Also important to avoid yay saying or nay saying. So this happens, yay saying is pretty much when people get bored answering the survey questions and they stop paying attention. And so they just answer yes to everything, or they answer no to everything. So it's called a response set. And it's very obvious when people are taking surveys, if they just, answer the same, in a ranking, the same thing, maybe it's agree, 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 agree. And it's pretty obvious they're not really thinking about the question. So that's a nightmare for people who are analyzing surveys. So too many similarly worded questions can result in loss of interest from the participant. So sometimes you'll see words that like it'll be reverse scored. That's what we call it. So that it's easy to tell if the participants are paying attention or not. So when we do surveys, it is self-report. So we have some assumptions. We're going to assume that people are being truthful and accurate when they respond to the surveys, right? Is it always true? No, right? But we're making that assumption. So problems would be like a response set, as I mentioned, that comes from laziness, where people get bored and just want to get through it quickly and, answer in a way that isn't thoughtful and then just hand it back to the person who's doing the surveys. Another problem is because it's self-report, people could be answering in a way that they think will make them look good, right? Social desirability. One way around that is to make sure the survey is anonymous. Demand characteristics, as I mentioned before, that's when a participant thinks that they know the hypothesis of the study and respond in a way that they think the researchers want them to respond. So they think they're helping the researchers. They're like, oh, I think they're trying to find out, shopping, my shopping patterns. So I'm going to tell them I shop a lot, even if I don't. That does not help. Always be truthful when you're responding to surveys. It does not help the researchers if you are lying, even if you think you know their hypothesis. The reason people are doing research is they want to know the truth, right? So always be honest in surveys. Response types, there are two kinds of response types similar to our exams. They're going to be close-ended, like multiple choice questions, where you choose one and it's very clear what people are responding to. And there's open-ended, and open-ended survey responses are like short answer responses, and they will need interpretation, a code book to interpret it. Any questions about this so far? Okay, so close-ended questions is called close-ended because the participants choose from limited alternatives. Example is multiple choice. Another example would be a rating scale. So with close-ended questions, they're actually more difficult to write because you need to consider the different options that people might want to select. So closed-ended questions are harder to write, but they're easier to analyze, right? So you have to do the work one way or another. There's never a situation where you have no work to do whatsoever. So with closed-ended questions, you need a lot more thought and care in the wording of the questions. And you also have to anticipate what potential answers will be, right? Because it is a limited number of alternatives. So harder to write, easier to analyze, definitely quantitative. You'll find out it's easy to do a lot of statistics on closed-ended questions. Open-ended questions, on the other hand, are like your short answer questions on your exams, right? You can respond in any way. It's exploratory. It also gives the respondents a chance to really express how they feel, and it shows how they're interpreting the question. So that's what's really nice about the open-ended questions. For example, what motivates you to work hard in school? So open-ended questions are much easier to write. Their responses, the analysis you have to do is qualitative, and so it's harder to analyze. Similar to interviews or like an observation, you're going to need a code book to interpret the transcription. So closed-ended questions, harder to write, easy to analyze. Open-ended questions, easy to write, more difficult to analyze. Depends on where you want to do the work. And of course, surveys can be, like your exams, a mix of both. So rating scales are a type of close-ended response. So they're often called Likert scales, and they're really good for capturing attitudes. So for example, I feel confident in my abilities as a student, and then you would select whichever one is reflects your feeling. Not at all representative of me, slightly representative of me, moderately representative of me, strongly representative of me. So these rating scales, if you look at them, they're equally spaced, right? So the assumption on the research side is that the difference between 1 and 2 is the same as between 2 and 3. So for rating scales, you can analyze it as if they are quantitative values. Any questions about rating scales? Okay. Another component to think about when you're creating a survey is how to format it, as in what are the types of information that you want to include, and how are you going to actually ask the questions? There's a science behind that. So first of all, in the introduction to the survey, you want to make sure you convey to the respondents how important it is to complete every question, right? You want to do that because when people don't complete the surveys, it really messes up your data. In the introduction, you should also establish informed consent. Let them know why you're asking them all these questions, right? The instructions need to be very clear. You might indicate how to use the response scales, and you might consider the order of the questions in which you are asking. So this has to do with a context effect. So the item order effect means that there are some questions, maybe very sensitive questions you want to ask. If you ask it right up front, it could change the way people respond for all the questions following it. So it's really important not to put sensitive questions at the very beginning. You also want to group items. If you are asking about a number of different aspects, dimensions, for example, of intelligence, it might be a good idea to group the items by theme so that it's not so hard for people to understand, right? If you switch too often, it could be confusing to people and they might just decide to do a response set and not think about the questions at all. So grouping items, you might do it by topic, part of construct validity. You could do it by the way people respond. So maybe you put all the rating scale responses together and you put all the true false scales questions together and you put all the short answer questions together. That's what I mean by grouping. We also recommend that you put demographic questions last. The reason we say this is because when people mark what their gender identity is, or their age, or their, how they identify racially or ethnic wise, that could actually affect how they answer all the other questions. So you want to make sure that you put demographic questions at the very end, not at the very beginning. Questions about this one? Okay. So there are different ways that you would administer the surveys. You can actually do face-to-face interviews. That's considered the gold standard. So we don't see it as often anymore. It definitely went down when COVID happened. But there used to be people who would be paid to go to malls and go up to people and just ask them survey questions, right? They would be paid by how many people they get to actually complete the surveys. What's nice about the face-to-face interviews is that there's a really high response rate. So once you actually get people to agree to answer the survey questions, very few will walk away before it's completed. So that's really nice. It's important for the person who's asking the questions to develop a rapport with the respondents. And it's what's important though to know also is there could be interview effects. So what you don't want is the person who's interviewing the people to influence the answers, right? So this is where that social desirability might come in. If you're doing a face-to-face interview and someone's asking questions, if they say, well, how do you feel about climate change? If you really don't care, but you're in a face-to-face interview, even though you didn't give your name or anything like that, you still might be embarrassed to say you don't care about climate change. And so you might lie. So that's the problem with the face-to-face component. It's also very expensive because you have to pay those people who are doing the surveys to be out in the malls and, asking all these questions. Telephone interviews are not as common, lower response rate. People will just hang up, right? Also, you don't know if the person who's answering the questions are actually paying attention to what you're saying because you're on the phone. You can't see them, right? So distractibility could be a problem. It's also more mentally taxing for somebody to listen on the phone and hear the questions. And it takes more time to cognitively process the questions. And remember that whole cognitive process about asking questions, you interpret it, you retrieve the information, you make kind of a judgment of how much you're going to reveal. All those things takes much longer in a telephone interview than it does in a face-to-face interview. There are still interviewer effects because you're talking to a live person, but it's not as much. It's not because you're not seeing them face to face. It's not as problematic as it is in a face-to-face situation. And there's also the idea that of cell phone effects. Fewer and fewer people have landlines. The vast majority of people have their cell phones. And so we could be missing an entire demographic of senior citizens who don't have cell phones and just have landlines, right? Or if we only call landlines, then we might miss out on people who have cell phones. So that whole component also makes it problematic for telephone interviews. Even less common than telephone interviews are mail surveys. So it used to be that you would like get a ton of surveys in the mail. Low labor costs because you're just printing a bunch of papers, right? But it costs, so that costs a lot of money. So high supply cost. The problem is very few people actually completed those surveys that they would get in the mail. It used to be that they would include like a dollar bill or something with the survey in hopes that if someone keeps the dollar bill, that they feel guilty enough to answer the survey. They don't really do that anymore, right? So lack of completion is a big problem. Now, what we have more than anything else are online surveys. Really cheap, right? Reduced labor and cost production. You're not killing any trees with online surveys. It gives you access to special groups, especially if you're targeting, people who bought certain items, then you can access those groups. Oftentimes they'll have incentives. Oh, fill this survey, you'll get a 10% coupon or 20% off your next purchase, that kind of thing. The problem with online surveys is there could be a lack of representation, meaning that those who actually answer the surveys are a special group in and of themselves. And so you could still be missing out on quite a few people. It is impossible to get everybody who bought those items to answer the survey, right? So a researcher needs to really consider that. Any questions about different ways we administer surveys? All right, so what to ask? Remember, it's going to be driven by your research objective, your research goal, your research question. The researcher needs to decide what they want to know. Talk about validities, right? So with face validity, the questions need to appear like they are relevant. With construct validity, you are making sure that the different aspects of the construct are included in your survey. So if we're talking about intelligence, you want to make sure it includes questions about mental processing, maybe about memory, about information retrieval, about creativity, all those different components. Content validity is that the experts of the field would agree that you have all these different aspects you're supposed to have. Types of questions, remember, are the attitudes and beliefs, facts and demographics, and behaviors. Likely in a survey, you would have a combination of all three. So when you have these combinations, somebody looking and analyzing it, remember, you're going to look for internal consistency, reliability, right? Do all these different components actually pertain to that construct that you have? If you have a survey that has you're addressing different constructs, you want to make sure you group it in a way that it keeps it easy to establish that internal consistency, reliability. Remember, with surveys, you'd also have to establish test-retest reliability. Moreover, if you have short answer questions, you want to have inter-rater reliability as well. So all of these parts need to be addressed with surveys. Again, it's important how you ask. So the whole idea of BRUSO, brief, relevant, unambiguous, specific, and objective. Make sure you know that and understand what each of those components entails. Remember, we have those different considerations. So how you ask, how people are responding, these parts are important, right? You want to make sure you have content validity. So what people are responding should be giving you the information that pertains to the construct that you want to study, right? That's really important. External validity, well, that goes to the sampling, and that's what we're going to talk about next, right? Sampling is really important. So with surveys, you don't have high internal validity. You're not manipulating anything. You are not controlling anything. So now what you really want to involve is external validity. You want to make sure that results from your survey are going to be results that pertain to other populations, other contexts, things like that. So this is where the importance of sampling comes in. Remember, in experiments, even if you don't have really ideal random sampling, you have random assignment. In a survey, you do not have random assignment, so sampling becomes really important to establish external validity. So who to ask? When we talk about surveys, we talk about sampling, samples, right? The population is all the cases, all the observations of interest to us. I could be interested in the population of adolescents, for example, but I'm only going to get a sample, which is a small subset of those cases or observations. It's really important for external validity of survey studies to have, as much as possible, probability sampling, and I'll talk about what that is. So we have two main types of sampling. That's probability sampling and non-probability sampling. And I'll explain what each one of those means. Another term for you to understand is sampling frame. So a sampling frame is really an operational definition of the population of interest, right? So it is the population from which your random sample is drawn. For example, maybe I want to look at preschoolers, right? But my sampling frame is going to be the preschoolers in ABC preschool, right? I get an enrollment list from ABC preschool, and then I randomly select 10 kids from this list. So that's an example. The sampling frame is the ABC school. My population of interest are preschoolers, but my sampling frame is going to be a small subset of that. That's how I'm defining those preschoolers. You want to have a representative sample, not a biased sample. So a biased sample would be if instead of randomly choosing from this enrollment list of kids, it's like, okay, I want to study sleep and academic achievement in preschoolers. So I am going to choose preschoolers who I know take frequent naps or something. That's what we mean by a non-representative biased sample. For external validity, you want to make sure you have a representative sample, meaning all the different kinds of kids that you might possibly have in a preschool. Remember that when you're sampling, you rarely have all the members of the population of interest. So you need to consider that bias can always be part of it. So as long as you have bias, you are decreasing external validity. So you want to reduce the chances of selection bias as much as possible. You want to show that you have a representative sample from the population so that after you get your results, you can say with confidence, these results will apply to other populations as well. Any questions about sampling frame? Okay. Probability sampling. In probability sampling, each member of the population has a specific and known likelihood of being chosen. So, for example, in the preschools, maybe in the year 2024, I have information from all the preschools in California, and I know exactly how many there are. And so if I do that and I say I'm going to be sampling from all these preschools, theoretically speaking, I actually know what the probability is of each child being selected to be part of my study, right? So we would be in probability sampling. You're actually using statistical theory to guide your sample selection. There are 3 types of probability sampling, okay? First one is simple random sampling. So for example, if my population of interest was every student in Evergreen Valley College, that would be my sampling frame, right? Every member of the sampling frame has an equal chance of being selected. So if that was my sampling frame, then the way I could do simple random sampling is I would put all the names of all the students at Evergreen, place it in a hat, and I just pull, 200 names out of it. That's simple random sampling. We know how many students there are. So once you know the exact number of the people there, then you would actually be able to derive what the probability is of each student being selected to be part of your study. That's an example of simple random sampling. Now, the problem with simple random sampling is if you want to have a specific number, excuse me, of particular students, right? So you might want to do stratified random sampling. So in stratified random sampling, what you do is you divide your sampling frame into subgroups. For example, you might want to say, gender identification, maybe male identified, female identified, non-binary, right? And then what you do, is you would have to know this information from your sampling frame, and then you would divide them into these subgroups. So all those who are male identified are in this hat, all those who are female identified are in the second hat, and all those who are non-binary are in the third hat, right? So you have divided them into these subgroups, and now you pull, okay, so I'm going to pull 50 from the first hat, 50 from the second hat, another 50 from the third hat, for a total of 150. When you do stratified random sampling, it's really nice because you are sure to have a representative sample from each. Now, let's say you want really representative, and you find out, okay, well, at Evergreen Valley College, 51% of our students are female identified. And so if you really want to be, proportionate to that, then you make sure that the number of names you pull from the female identified group would equal to 51% of your sample selection. That's how you would make sure that it is truly representative of the population of students at Evergreen Valley College. So stratified random sampling is a very useful way to make sure that you have a representative group, because if you just use simple random sampling, there's no telling how many you're going to get of each, right? Because it's purely random. So stratified random sampling is a good way to ensure representation. Cluster sampling, you would use that if you don't have a ready-made sampling frame to represent your population of interest. So it's not, there are some populations of interest, like college-going students, that's really easy to get. Maybe you might say, there's only a certain percentage of these students that I would be interested in. So, and I'm not going to get enough in each population. So maybe it could be something like, I don't know, students who like to play hockey, right? So maybe in Evergreen Valley College, hockey is not that popular of a sport. So if I only stuck to Evergreen Valley College, I'm not going to get enough from my participants. I'm going to have to go elsewhere. So this is where you might use cluster sampling. So what you're going to do is you're going to identify different areas where you might be able to get these participants, right? And then you randomly sample from those clusters. So with single cluster sampling, right, you have all your participants randomly being selected in these clusters. And from that's where you get your participants, right? So you have these clusters, And you are randomly selecting among those clusters who your participants are going to be coming from, and you get everybody from that group. So let's say you have clusters of students who like hockey at Evergreen Valley College, and you have San Jose City College. Maybe you go through all of the community colleges in California. Those are your clusters, right? Now what you're going to do is you're going to list all of these community colleges in California that have people who like hockey. And then you're going to randomly select which clusters are going to be in your study. And when you select that cluster, it means that all the students in that community college are going to be sampled and be part of your study. All the students who like hockey in community college are going to be in Evergreen Valley College will be part of your study if Evergreen Valley College was one of the ones that you pulled out of the hat. So it's called cluster sampling because you're not just choosing like names of individual students, you're choosing names of where the clusters are found. That's how it works. So multi-stage sampling is sort of similar to the stratified sampling where you might have like subdivide certain groups. So maybe you would divide it Northern California community colleges and Southern California community colleges and then choose from those. So here's an example, okay? Let's say these are all these different elementary schools. And I wanted to know, okay, we could say that, okay, what if I want to know who plays hockey in elementary school? Here's a list of all the elementary schools that exist. Then what I do is put all the names of these elementary schools in a hat, and maybe I'll pull out 10 of them. And the names of those 10 elementary schools, those kids in each of those schools, all of the kids who like hockey, those are going to be my participants. That's how it works for cluster sampling. Questions about cluster sampling? Okay, so those are the three types of probability sampling, right? We had simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, and cluster sampling. In non-probability sampling, the probability of being selected is not known. This is far more frequent, especially if you think about it, online surveys, right? You don't know how many people actually bought these books in Amazon because one person could have bought 10 different copies, right? Things like that. So when you're doing something like an online survey, it's going to be non-probability sampling. You have no idea how many people are actually going to be reached by the survey. So with non-probability sampling, the probability of being selected is not known. It is less costly, it's easier to obtain. There is a threat to external validity here because it's harder for us to make sure we get a representative sample when we're doing non-probability sampling. So let's talk about the different types of non-probability sampling. Convenience sampling is the most frequent type of sampling we have, right? It's also known as haphazard sampling. In this one, the sample is being selected in a way that's convenient to the researchers. That's why it's called convenience sampling. Problem with it is that you could be biased, right? There's a chance that the actual sample you get does not reflect the population, which becomes a threat to external validity. But it's still common, right? Because it's less expensive, it's faster, it's easier to obtain. What we do find that is that even if something is determined through convenience sampling, we do find that a lot of times we do find it in other groups as well. So findings still matter. We still want to report it, even if somebody might argue you can't totally generalize it because it's convenient sampling. It's still interesting findings that we get, right? And we also find that some non-probability samples might be more representative than others. So this is something that we have come to terms with in research, that a lot of times we're going to use convenience sampling. We have to disclose it in our, in our write-up that we used convenience sampling, and we have to kind of explain in our discussion why we still think it could be relevant to others. So different types of non-probability sampling. First is quota sampling. So with quota sampling, it's analogy is the stratified random sampling. So with quota sampling, right, you want to make sure that your sample reflects the numerical composition of different subgroups. So for example, quota sampling would be saying 51% should be female, and we're going to keep collecting till we get that proportion. So it's very similar to stratified random sampling. The difference is that the sample is not randomly selected. So that weakens the external validity and increases the possibility of bias. Another one is purposive sampling. In purposive sampling, the people we survey are selected because they meet specific criteria. Example of this would be expert sampling. So maybe instead of just finding out who likes hockey, maybe we want to ask only the NFL players. Whoops, NHL players, NFL, NHL players, right? Maybe we're only going to ask people who are in the top 10 teams of the National Hockey League. That's an example of expert sampling. So we're not randomly just asking any people about their opinions about hockey. We are looking for the experts, and there's nothing wrong with that. Another way that we do purposive sampling is called snowball sampling. So we use snowball sampling if it is a population who is challenging to get. So for example, homeless people. If you get maybe one or two people who agree to be part of your survey, you might say to them, hey, if you thought this was a really good experience, if you think that it would be helpful to others, can you please ask other people, who are unhoused, if they would like to participate in the survey as well? And that's an example of snowball sampling. So existing participants are asked to recruit more participants who meet the criteria for inclusion. So that's, you would use that for groups who are really difficult to contact. Again, problem with that is that could be bias, right? You increase the chance that it's not going to reflect the population because you're getting people who agreed to come to do a survey to recruit others. And so the people they know will be very similar to them. And so that's going to decrease the chance of really getting a fully representative sample. But if it's a difficult group to contact, you're going to try to learn everything you can. And again, in your write-up, you're going to explain that you used purposive sampling or snowball sampling and why you had to use it that way. A very, very frequent type of non-probability sampling is self-selection sampling. So this individuals choose to take part in the research of their own accord without being approached directly by the researcher. When you get a survey from Amazon, oh, thank you for buying this book, please tell us what you think about it. That's an example of self-selection sampling because not everyone is going to respond to that survey. Only a few, some people who really like to give their opinions will do it. So most psychological research does involve self-selected convenience samples, right? So colleges, magazine advertisements, online recruiting, all of these are examples of self-selection sampling. What we rely on is if the hypothesis is accurate, meaning like the pattern of behavior that the researchers have predicted will come true, it's going to hold even with self-selected sampling. So that is kind of the saving part of even relying on non-probability sampling, is that if these observations we have made about humans are consistent, even with self-selection sampling, the results we find will likely hold to other groups as well. And so that's the part that helps us, right? And this is where replicating these studies, replicating these surveys with other groups becomes important. So don't just, maybe sample people on Amazon. Maybe you should sample people on Etsy. Maybe you should sample people, who buy from stores directly, those kind of things. So that's what I mean by trying to replicate it in different venues. So now we also want to make sure that we are evaluating our samples. This goes into our write-up, right? The larger the sample you have, the more likely it's going to represent the population. You have to state a target sample. So in your research proposal, right, the larger the set you have, it's good, but you can't say, oh, I'm just going to keep collecting forever. At some point, you have to stop collecting the data and start analyzing the data. So you might say, I'm going to collect 2,000, responses. That's fine. It's not that hard actually in this day with online access, but you do have to indicate a target population. It's not good enough to say, oh, I'm just going to get as many as I can get. No, you should have a target population so that you can stop once you've reached that target and start analyzing your data. Ideally, you want to randomly sample from all the individuals in the population. The larger the sample, the better in terms of your external validity. And you want to make sure you complete that these people who you are getting actually completes the full survey. That's the other part. Remember that there could be sampling bias, right? So sampling bias happens when you get survey responses from a non-representative group, and that could be problematic depending on what the nature of your research is. If you get, people, all people of just a certain political affiliation, maybe that could be problematic. And if you don't reveal that, you surveyed from this group, then it could be skewing your results and you could be sharing misinformation. So you want to make sure when you're doing research, you fully disclose who your sample is and how you collected your data. Another component to think about is response rate. I kind of mentioned this a number of times in terms of the way that you obtain people's responses, right? Face-to-face, excellent response rate because people don't walk away without completing it. So the response rate is the percent of people in the sample who actually complete the survey. What we know is that those who don't complete the survey actually are a specific type, right? So those who actually complete surveys, who decide, oh yes, I want to give my opinion, that's a certain profile. And those who decide that they don't want to complete them, that's a certain profile as well. So non-respondents, when non-respondents significantly differ from respondents, we call that non-response bias, right? The lower your response rate, the likelihood, the higher the likelihood that bias will affect your findings, and that will decrease your ability to generalize. It will decrease your external validity. And that's problematic because that's all we really have for surveys. We don't have internal validity for surveys. The component for internal validity in surveys is how you are wording your questions and making sure that people are completing the surveys. Okay. So just to sum up again, why do we use surveys? Well, we can use it to describe characteristics of a population, right? Goal being description. We can use it to compare characteristics of different populations or different demographic groups with a larger population. That's another way we can do it. We can use it to describe population time trends. We use surveys to establish correlations, right? Describing relations among variables. We can use surveys to give us variables also for prediction. We can also use surveys to test hypotheses, theories, and models. So surveys are extremely useful tools in our research design toolbox. Limitations of surveys. Well, you cannot use it to establish cause and effect relationships. If the sampling techniques are poor, it's really going to affect your results. So that's a limitation. We're also relying on self-report. So we are relying on people telling us the honest truth, to be accurate and truthful. And that's a limitation because not everyone will be, right? So we do what we can, though, to mitigate all those components. In terms of surveys and validity, you want to make sure that as you are composing your questions, you are meeting validity, right? Face validity, that the questions at least appear to the untrained eye that the questions are relevant to what you want to study. The construct validity, you want to make sure that you are having different aspects of the dimension of the psychological construct included. You want to content validity. That is something that you're going to establish in your literature review, looking what the experts, how have previous studies, researchers examined this construct. This is where citations come in as well, right? Criterion validity. If you are establishing your own measure, you want to make sure that you are actually looking at existing measures as well. So criterion validity, convergent validity, you're taking results at, doesn't have to be at the same time, but that they are all leading to the same conclusion. Remember, we're looking for correlations here. We're looking for positive correlations, 0.8 or higher. Discriminant validity is the opposite. We are looking for low correlations or negative correlations. We use discriminant validity to distinguish different psychological constructs. How are you telling the difference between anxiety and depression, for example? Concurrent validity would be if you have, different measures at the same time. So in one survey packet, you might have two different measures because you're establishing concurrent validity. Maybe you want to have a new measure of IQ, for example. Predictive validity would be maybe the variables that you have in your survey are going to be used to anticipate how somebody will be doing, what someone will be doing in the future. Statistical validity, you want the sample size to be as large as possible so that you can conduct good analyses. So the more different variables you're studying, the larger the sample size you will need. Minimum of 30 or more per variable of interest, right? In order to get the statistical validity. And then external validity is going to be established as you have, diverse representative groups that you are sampling. So those are all the different components of surveys. So both in the construction of the question and also the analysis and the sampling. Those are the important parts that you would have to have for a survey. Any questions? I'm going to stop the recording right now.